The yard went quiet the moment the blind inmate stepped onto the concrete. He walked slowly, tapping the cracked ground with a worn metal cane, head tilted slightly as if listening to things no one else could hear. Most inmates ignored him. Some pitied him. Only one saw an easy target, the prison bully. He smirked, cracked his knuckles, and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Let's see how the blind guy handles this." Then his boot shot forward. A brutal kick to the inmate's back. The blind man stumbled, dropped to one knee, his cane clattering across the yard. Laughter erupted. "Couldn't even see it coming. Man's useless." But the blind inmate didn't look scared. He didn't shake. He didn't panic. He just placed one hand on the ground and lifted his head, slowly, calmly, almost deliberately. That's when the bully noticed something was off. The yard had fallen completely silent. No whispers, no jokes, no movement. Just inmates staring at the blind man like they'd seen this moment before, because they had. The blind man rose to his feet with unnatural precision. His eyes were fogged, unfocused, but the way he turned his body made it clear he wasn't relying on sight at all. "Try that again," he said softly. The bully stepped back, too late, because everyone else in that yard knew the truth. The man he'd just kicked wasn't helpless. He was a lethal fighter, a former close-quarters combat instructor who trained elite units using sound, vibration, and reflexes sharper than any sighted man. And now he knew exactly where the bully was standing. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next in that yard will make you question everything you thought you knew about strength, fear, and instinct. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Marcus Thompson arrived at Riverside Correctional on a Tuesday morning, shackled and silent. The guards led him through intake processing with the same routine they'd performed thousands of times before. Height, weight, fingerprints, photographs, but something felt different about this one. He moved with a strange confidence, his clouded eyes scanning nothing, yet somehow taking in everything. The intake officer glanced at his paperwork. "Says here you're legally blind." Marcus nodded once. "Lost my sight in Afghanistan. Roadside bomb." The officer's expression softened slightly. Combat veterans usually got a bit more respect, even in a place like this. "What are you in for?" Marcus replied quietly. "Manslaughter. Self-defense gone wrong." Word spread fast in prison. It always does. By lunch, every inmate knew the basics. New guy, blind, ex-military, killed someone on the outside. The reactions varied. Some felt sympathy. Others saw vulnerability. But Tank Morrison, the yard's undisputed king, saw opportunity. Tank stood 6'4" and weighed 250, all muscle and meanness. He'd been running this place for 3 years, ever since the previous top dog got shanked in the shower. His reputation was built on fear, intimidation, and the occasional brutal beating that reminded everyone who held the power. Tank didn't like changes to his ecosystem, especially changes that might shift the attention away from him. "Blind boy thinks he's special," Tank muttered to his crew during lunch, "walking around here like he owns the place." His lieutenant, a wiry man called Spider, shook his head. "Man's just trying to get by. He's not bothering nobody." Tank's eyes narrowed. "That's the problem. Everyone's looking at him with pity. Makes them forget who runs this yard." He slammed his fist on the metal table. Time to remind them. What Tank didn't know, what none of them knew, was Marcus Thompson's real story. Before the bomb, before the blindness, before the incident that landed him in prison, Marcus had been something special. Staff Sergeant Thompson, close-quarters combat instructor for Army Special Forces. He'd trained Navy SEALs, Delta Force operators, and Marines in hand-to-hand combat techniques designed for the most extreme situations. After losing his sight, Marcus didn't give up. He adapted. He learned to fight without vision, relying on sound, vibration, and an almost supernatural sense of spatial awareness. He could track multiple opponents by their breathing patterns, predict attacks by the shift of weight on floorboards, and strike with precision that defied belief. The manslaughter charge came from a bar fight gone wrong. 3 men had cornered him outside a veterans club, thinking a blind man would be easy prey. They were wrong. When the police arrived, 2 were unconscious, 1 had a shattered collarbone, and Marcus was standing calmly beside them, barely breathing hard. The judge called it excessive force. Marcus called it survival. Now, 6 months into his sentence, Marcus had settled into prison routine. He kept to himself, stayed out of politics, and avoided the common areas during peak times. He'd figured out the guard rotations, memorized the layout of every building, and identified the key players in the prison hierarchy. He knew Tank Morrison was watching him. He knew this confrontation was inevitable. The morning of the incident started like any other. Marcus woke at 5:30, did his exercises in his cell, and waited for the breakfast call. His cellmate, an older man named Luis, who was serving time for tax evasion, had become protective of him. "You want me to walk with you today?" Luis asked. Marcus shook his head. "I'm fine. Same routine as always." But something felt different in the air. The usual morning chatter seemed more subdued. Guards were positioned differently. Even the sound of footsteps in the corridor carried a tension he hadn't noticed before. During breakfast, Marcus sat alone at his usual table near the back wall. He could hear Tank's voice from across the room, louder than necessary, making comments about special treatment and charity cases. Other inmates were listening, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. In prison, you either stood with the power or got crushed by it. After breakfast, Marcus made his way to the yard for his daily walk. This was his meditation time, his chance to process the sounds and rhythms of the prison around him. He'd mapped every inch of that concrete space, knew where the basketball courts were, where inmates gathered to smoke, where the guards typically positioned themselves. He stepped through the heavy metal door, his cane tapping lightly against the ground. The morning sun warmed his face as he began his slow circuit around the perimeter. Behind him, he could hear Tank's boots on the concrete, heavy and deliberate. The big man was making his move. The yard began to empty as word spread. Inmates found reasons to be elsewhere or positioned themselves at safe distances where they could watch without getting involved. This was theater, and everyone knew their role. Tank was the star. Marcus was the victim, and they were the audience. Marcus continued walking, his breathing steady, his mind calculating distances and angles. He could hear Tank's heartbeat now, elevated with adrenaline and excitement. He could smell the man's sweat, mixed with cheap deodorant and institutional soap. Most importantly, he could feel the shift in the concrete beneath his feet as Tank approached from behind. The first kick came without warning, a vicious strike aimed at Marcus's lower back. It connected hard, sending him stumbling forward. His cane flew from his hand, clattering across the yard as he dropped to one knee. The impact sent waves of pain through his spine, but Marcus had felt worse, much worse. The laughter started immediately. Inmates who'd been watching from a distance began to circle closer, sensing blood in the water. "Damn, Tank! You knocked him down with one hit!" Blind boy didn't even see it coming. This is going to be over quick. But Marcus wasn't down. Not really. He placed his palm flat against the warm concrete, feeling the vibrations of approaching footsteps, listening to the subtle changes in breathing patterns around him. Tank was directly behind him now, probably gearing up for another kick. The other inmates were forming a loose circle, maybe 15 feet away. 2 guards were approaching from the east tower, but they were still 30 seconds out. 30 seconds was more than enough time. Marcus lifted his head slowly, his clouded eyes seeming to look directly at Tank despite their obvious blindness. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "Try that again." That's when the yard went completely silent. Because the older inmates, the ones who'd been here long enough to recognize real danger, suddenly remembered where they'd heard that tone before. It was the voice of someone who'd killed before and would do it again if necessary. Tank took a step back, but it was already too late. Because Marcus Thompson wasn't just getting to his feet. He was calculating angles, measuring distances, and preparing to demonstrate exactly why the Army had once considered him their most effective close-quarters combat instructor. The lesson was about to begin. Tank's confidence cracked the moment he saw Marcus rise. Something primal in his gut told him to back away, but his reputation was on the line. Every eye in that yard was watching. Every inmate was waiting to see if the king would hold his throne or crumble in front of a blind man. "You think you're tough?" Tank growled, trying to reclaim his authority. He stepped forward again, fists clenched. "I'll put you in the infirmary where you belong." Marcus tilted his head slightly, like a predator tracking prey. His breathing remained steady, controlled, professional. "You're standing 3 feet away," he said quietly. "Your weight is on your left foot. Your right shoulder is dropped. You telegraph every move before you make it." Tank's eyes widened. How could he possibly know that? "Lucky guess," he muttered, but his voice carried less conviction now. "Try me," Marcus replied. The circle of inmates pressed closer, sensing something extraordinary about to unfold. Even the guards approaching from the tower slowed their pace, curious about what was happening. In prison, fights were common, but this felt different. This felt like watching a master at work. Tank swung hard, a haymaker aimed at Marcus's head. It was the kind of punch that had dropped dozens of men over the years. Marcus moved like water, shifting his weight just enough to let the fist slice through empty air. Tank's momentum carried him forward, off balance, vulnerable. Marcus could have ended it right there. One precise strike to Tank's exposed throat would have dropped him instantly. But this wasn't about winning quickly. This was about sending a message that would echo through every cell block for years to come. Instead, Marcus stepped aside and let Tank stumble past him. "Too slow," he said calmly. "Too predictable." Tank spun around, fury replacing confidence. "Stand still and fight me!" He charged forward, both fists swinging wildly. Marcus ducked under the first punch, sidestepped the second, and caught Tank's wrist on the third attempt. For just a moment, he held the bigger man's arm in place, applying pressure to a nerve cluster he'd learned in military training. Tank's hand went numb instantly. "You feel that?" Marcus asked conversationally. "That's your radial nerve shutting down. I could snap your elbow right now if I wanted to." He released Tank's arm and stepped back. Tank flexed his fingers, trying to restore feeling to his hand. Around them, the crowd had gone completely silent. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a demonstration. "Why aren't you finishing this?" Tank demanded, shaking his hand to restore circulation. Marcus smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Because I'm not the animal you think I am, but I could be if you push me." Tank looked around the yard, seeing doubt in the faces of inmates who'd followed him for years. His authority was crumbling with every second he failed to put down the blind man. Desperation made him dangerous. He pulled a sharpened toothbrush from his waistband, a crude but effective prison shank. "Let's see you dodge this." The moment the makeshift weapon appeared, the atmosphere shifted. Inmates backed away further, recognizing that this had escalated beyond a simple dominance display. Guards began moving faster toward the confrontation, but they were still 20 seconds away. 20 seconds was a lifetime in combat. Marcus heard the distinctive whistle of the shank cutting through air before Tank even began his attack. Metal against plastic had a unique sound signature, one he'd learned to recognize in the chaos of urban warfare. His body moved before his mind consciously processed the threat. Tank lunged forward with the shank, aiming for Marcus's chest. Marcus twisted away from the blade, grabbed Tank's wrist with both hands, and used the bigger man's momentum against him. A textbook disarming technique executed with surgical precision. The shank went flying across the concrete as Tank found himself face down on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold that made him cry out in pain. "You feel that pressure on your shoulder joint?" Marcus asked, his voice still eerily calm. I increase it by 2 inches, and your arm snaps. 3 inches, and you never use it again. Tank struggled against the hold, but every movement only increased the pressure on his shoulder. Okay, let me go. Are we done here? Marcus asked. Yeah, we're done. Marcus released the hold and stood up, his movements fluid and controlled. Tank rolled away, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted with pain and humiliation. Around them, the crowd of inmates stared in stunned silence. But Marcus wasn't finished teaching his lesson. He walked slowly toward where his cane had fallen, picked it up, and tapped it once against the concrete. The sound echoed across the suddenly quiet yard. Let me explain something to all of you, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the silence. I didn't lose my sight in some accident. I lost it fighting for this country, defending the freedom that let you make the choices that landed you in here. He turned slowly, his unfocused eyes somehow seeming to make contact with every inmate in the circle. I've killed enemy combatants with my bare hands. I've survived firefights that would break most of you. I've trained soldiers who went on to become legends in special operations. Losing my sight didn't make me weak. It made me adapt. It made me better. Tank was still on the ground, no longer the fearsome presence that had dominated the yard for years. Other inmates looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. His reign was over, ended not by violence but by the simple demonstration that real strength didn't come from size or aggression. I'm not here to run this place, Marcus continued. I'm not here to challenge anyone or prove anything. I just want to serve my time and go home. But if any of you think my blindness makes me an easy target, I suggest you reconsider. The guards finally reached the scene, expecting to find a beaten man and a victorious bully. Instead, they found Tank sitting on the ground nursing his shoulder, while Marcus stood calmly in the center of a circle of awed inmates. What happened here? The lead guard demanded. Tank looked up, his eyes filled with shame and rage. For a moment, it seemed like he might lie, might try to salvage some dignity from the situation. But the truth was written in the faces of every witness. Nothing, he muttered. Just a misunderstanding. The guard looked suspicious but didn't press the issue. Prison fights were common, but this didn't look like any fight he'd seen before. No blood, no visible injuries, except Tank's obvious discomfort. Everyone back to your activities, the guard ordered. Show's over. But the show wasn't over. Not really. Because what had just happened would be talked about in every cell, every common area, every quiet corner of the prison for months to come. The story would grow with each telling, becoming legend. Marcus Thompson, the blind inmate who'd dismantled the most feared man in the facility without breaking a sweat, who'd shown mercy when he could have shown destruction, who'd proven that true strength came not from what you could do to others, but from what you chose not to do. As the crowd dispersed, several inmates approached Marcus with newfound respect. They offered protection he didn't need, friendship he hadn't asked for, and allegiance he hadn't sought. Word spread through the cell blocks like wildfire. The blind man wasn't to be messed with. Tank Morrison was finished, and everyone who'd witnessed the confrontation knew they'd seen something special, something that would change the dynamic of Riverside Correctional forever. But Tank Morrison wasn't finished. Not yet. Humiliation burned in his chest like acid, eating away at his pride and his sanity. As he watched inmates show respect to the man who'd destroyed him, Tank began planning his revenge. That night, Tank Morrison sat on his bunk staring at the concrete wall. His shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder of his humiliation. Around him, the cell block buzzed with whispered conversations about what had happened in the yard. Every word was like a knife twisting deeper into his wounded pride. "Did you see how fast he moved?" one inmate whispered from the next cell. "Tank never even had a chance." Another voice replied, "Man's like a ghost, blind but sees everything." Tank's hands clenched into fists as the conversations continued. 3 years of building his own reputation, 3 years of commanding respect through fear, destroyed in less than 2 minutes by a man who couldn't even see his face. His cellmate, a nervous kid named Jimmy who was in for check fraud, tried to make conversation. "Maybe it's not as bad as you think, Tank. People forget things around here pretty quick." Tank's head turned slowly toward him, eyes burning with rage. Jimmy quickly looked away and pretended to read a magazine, but Tank knew better. In prison, reputation was everything. Once you showed weakness, once you got beaten down in front of the whole yard, the vultures started circling. He could already see it starting. Inmates who used to step aside when he walked past now barely acknowledged him. Guards who used to treat him with wary respect now looked at him like just another convict. The worst part was knowing that Marcus Thompson hadn't even tried to humiliate him. The blind man had shown restraint, mercy even. He could have broken Tank's arm, could have left him screaming on the concrete, but he'd chosen not to. That restraint somehow made the defeat even more crushing. 3 cells down, Marcus was having his own quiet conversation with Luis. His cellmate was practically vibrating with excitement. "Man, I've been in this place for 2 years and I've never seen anything like that. You made Tank look like an amateur." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't want to fight him. I just wanted to be left alone." Luis leaned forward. "You realize what you just did, right? Tank's been running this place like his personal kingdom. Nobody crossed him without paying for it. And you just dethroned him without breaking a sweat." Marcus sat on his bunk, running his fingers along his cane. "That's exactly what I was trying to avoid. Now everyone's going to be watching me, testing me, trying to prove themselves." "Maybe," Luis said, "but they're also going to respect you. And respect in here is better than money, better than protection. It's everything." Marcus nodded slowly. He understood the dynamics at play, had seen similar situations in military units. When you defeated the Alpha, you didn't just win a fight. You inherited all their enemies, all their responsibilities, all their problems. Down the corridor, a group of inmates gathered around Tank's known associates. Spider, his former lieutenant, was fielding questions from younger prisoners who wanted to know where their loyalties should lie. "Tank's still Tank," Spider insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "One fight doesn't change 3 years of running things." A muscular inmate named Carlos laughed. "One fight? Man, that wasn't a fight. That was an education. Tank got schooled by a blind man in front of the whole yard." Others nodded in agreement. The tide was turning, and everyone could feel it. The next morning brought new tensions. During breakfast, Marcus noticed the changes immediately. Conversation stopped when he entered the cafeteria. Inmates who'd never spoken to him before nodded respectfully as he passed. Others watched him with calculating eyes, trying to figure out how to use this shift in power to their advantage. Tank sat at his usual table, but the crowd around him had thinned considerably. Only his most loyal followers remained, and even they seemed uncertain. When Marcus walked past carrying his tray, Tank's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The memory of his shoulder locked in that submission hold was still too fresh. At his corner table, Marcus ate in relative peace until a group of younger inmates approached. Their leader, a stocky kid with gang tattoos covering his arms, cleared his throat nervously. "Yo, Thompson, that was some serious moves yesterday. You got any interest in training some of us?" Marcus looked up, his clouded eyes somehow managing to convey authority. "I'm not looking for students. I'm looking for quiet," the kid persisted. "Come on, man. You could make some serious money teaching us those techniques. Guys in here would pay good commissary money for that kind of knowledge." "Walk away," Marcus said quietly. There was something in his tone that made the kid take a step back. "I said no. Don't ask again." The group retreated, whispering among themselves about the blind man's intensity. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. In prison, power vacuums didn't stay empty long. Either someone would step up to challenge Tank's weakened position, or Tank himself would try to reclaim his authority through increasingly desperate means. Neither option was good for Marcus. His prediction proved accurate by lunchtime. A massive inmate named Diesel, who'd been waiting for his chance to move up the hierarchy, decided to make his play. He'd been serving time for armed robbery and had a reputation for brutal efficiency. Unlike Tank, who relied on intimidation and occasional violence, Diesel was known for ending problems permanently. As Marcus made his way to his usual lunch spot, Diesel intercepted him. The big man stood nearly 7 feet tall and weighed close to 300 pounds, all muscle and scars. "We need to talk," Diesel said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. Marcus stopped, tilting his head slightly. He could hear the shift in the cafeteria's atmosphere, the way conversations died as inmates sensed potential violence. "About what?" he asked calmly. "About respect. About territory. About the way things work in here." Diesel cracked his knuckles, a sound like breaking branches. "You embarrassed Tank yesterday, and that created a problem for all of us. See, when the top dog gets taken down, it makes everyone restless, makes them think they can challenge the natural order." Marcus set his tray down on a nearby table. "I'm not interested in your natural order. I just want to serve my time in peace." Diesel laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Peace? You think what you did yesterday was peaceful? You humiliated a man in front of the whole yard. That's an act of war." Around them, inmates began positioning themselves for the best view while staying far enough away to avoid getting caught in the crossfire. Guards were present, but they maintained their usual distance unless actual violence broke out. Prison politics were generally left to sort themselves out. "Tank started that fight," Marcus said evenly. "I finished it. That's all." Diesel stepped closer, using his size to intimidate. "That's where you're wrong, blind man. You didn't finish anything. You started something that's going to ripple through this place for years, and since you're not smart enough to understand what you've done, I'm going to have to clean up your mess." Marcus could feel the big man's breath on his face, could smell the mixture of institutional soap and barely controlled rage. Diesel was different from Tank. Where Tank had been a bully who relied on fear and occasional violence, Diesel was a predator. He didn't fight for dominance or respect. He fought to eliminate threats. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said quietly. "Walk away while you still can." Diesel's laughter boomed through the cafeteria. "While I still can? You think because you got lucky with Tank, you can handle me? I've killed men twice your size. I've broken bones that doctors said would never heal. You're about to learn the difference between a playground bully and a real killer." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Other inmates held their breath, waiting to see if the blind man who dethroned Tank could handle an even more dangerous challenger. But Marcus wasn't thinking about reputation or politics or prison hierarchies. He was thinking about survival. Because unlike Tank's clumsy attempt at dominance, Diesel's challenge carried the promise of real violence. This wouldn't be a lesson in restraint and controlled force. This would be a fight to determine who walked away and who got carried to the infirmary. Marcus had faced killers before. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in dark alleys and hostile territory around the world. He'd survived because he understood something that most people never learned. Sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be absolutely prepared for war. "Last chance," he told Diesel. "Walk away." The big man's response was a fist the size of a small ham, launched toward Marcus's head with enough force to shatter bone. But Marcus had been listening to Diesel's heartbeat, tracking his breathing patterns, measuring the distance between them, with senses honed by years of combat training. He knew the punch was coming before Diesel's muscles even began to contract. What happened next would become the stuff of prison legend, because the inmates of Riverside Correctional were about to learn that their new alpha wasn't just skilled, he was lethal. And when pushed beyond the point of restraint, Marcus Thompson was capable of demonstrating exactly why the military had once considered him one of their most dangerous weapons. The lesson was about to continue, but this time, mercy might not be an option. Diesel's massive fist cut through the air like a sledgehammer, aimed directly at Marcus's skull. The cafeteria held its collective breath expecting to see the blind man's head snap back from the devastating impact. Instead, Marcus moved like liquid mercury, tilting just enough to let the punch whistle past his ear. The momentum of Diesel's missed swing carried him forward, off balance and exposed. Marcus stepped inside the big man's reach and drove his elbow upward into Diesel's solar plexus with surgical precision. The impact folded Diesel in half, driving every ounce of air from his lungs in a single explosive gasp. Before Diesel could recover, Marcus grabbed the back of his massive head and brought his knee up hard. The crack of cartilage breaking echoed through the suddenly silent cafeteria as Diesel's nose exploded in a spray of blood. The giant stumbled backward, hands clutching his ruined face, blood streaming between his fingers. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered from across the room. "He just dropped Diesel like he was nothing." But Marcus wasn't finished. Diesel was hurt, but not down, and wounded giants were often the most dangerous. The big man wiped blood from his eyes and charged again, roaring with rage and pain. This time Marcus didn't try to dodge. He planted his feet and met the charge head-on. Diesel's massive arms wrapped around Marcus in a crushing bear hug, lifting him off the ground. The big man squeezed with all his strength, trying to crack ribs, collapse lungs, crush the life out of his smaller opponent. Other inmates winced at the pressure being applied, imagining their own bones snapping under that grip. Marcus remained calm. He'd been in worse situations, trapped by stronger enemies in darker places. His hands found the nerve clusters behind Diesel's ears and pressed with precise force. The big man's grip loosened immediately as his arms went partially numb. Marcus dropped back to his feet and stepped away as Diesel stumbled, shaking his head to clear the sudden dizziness. "You feel that tingling in your arms?" Marcus asked conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "That's your nervous system shutting down. I could have pressed harder and put you to sleep permanently." Diesel's eyes widened with fear for the first time in years. No one had ever made him feel helpless before. No one had ever treated his size and strength like minor inconveniences to be worked around. But this blind man was dismantling him piece by piece, explaining each technique like a professor teaching a class. The cafeteria had gone completely silent. Even the guards were watching now, too fascinated by the display to intervene. They'd seen plenty of prison fights, but nothing like this systematic destruction of a man twice the fighter's size. Diesel made one last desperate attempt, pulling a crude shiv from his sock. The weapon gleamed dully in the fluorescent light as he slashed wildly at Marcus's chest. The blade missed by inches as Marcus swayed backward, then forward, then sideways, making Diesel look like he was fighting a ghost. The blade clattered harmlessly to the floor as Marcus twisted Diesel's wrist with devastating efficiency. The massive inmate dropped to his knees, his arm bent at an impossible angle, tears streaming down his bloodied face. The cafeteria erupted in stunned silence as guards finally moved in to restore order. Marcus stepped back, adjusting his shirt calmly. Around him, 300 inmates stared in absolute awe. Tank Morrison watched from his corner table, his face pale with the realization that challenging this man would have been suicide. Word would spread through every prison in the state within hours. The blind veteran had just dismantled two of the most feared men in Riverside Correctional without breaking a sweat. He'd proven that true strength wasn't about size or aggression, but about discipline, training, and the quiet confidence that comes from surviving real war. As Marcus picked up his cane and walked toward the exit, inmates parted like water before him. Some nodded respectfully. Others simply stared. All of them understood they'd witnessed something extraordinary. The blind man who'd redefined what it meant to be dangerous. Marcus Thompson would serve the rest of his sentence in complete peace, because everyone now knew the truth that Tank and Diesel had learned too late. Sometimes the most lethal weapon in the room is the one you never see coming.